My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
We need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Welcome to Season 2 of Diplomatic Immunity. I'm Alistair Somerville, editor at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University and producer of this podcast. On Diplomatic Immunity, we bring you frank and candid conversations on the issues facing diplomats and national security decision-makers in the US and around the world. We talk to current and former diplomatic officials, scholars, and analysts seeking to understand how best to foster international cooperation in an age of global crises. In Season 2, we will continue to engage diplomats and scholars, both career officials and others who further the work of diplomacy, in conversations about the issues ISD cares most about: national security challenges facing the new administration, global commons issues like global health and information operations, diversity in the US Foreign Service and the foreign affairs community, and learning lessons from diplomatic history. For the first episode of this new season, ISD Director of Programs and Research Kelly McFarland sat down with Arsalan Suleman. Arsalan served as acting US Special Envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation during the Obama administration, and Kelly chatted to him about his role as first a fellow and then a political appointee under President Obama. Arsalan is also a non-resident fellow here at ISD and has written on the Trump administration's approach to multilateral diplomacy. He is also an international lawyer, currently working on human rights issues as a counsel at Foley Hoag. We talked about all of this and more during the episode. One key takeaway, and a particularly apt one in the times we currently find ourselves in: diplomacy, and particularly multilateral diplomacy within international organizations, is like preventative healthcare. You only notice it when it's gone. This is an important message as the US seeks to rejoin international agreements and multilateral organizations under a new administration, placing diplomacy front and center once again. Make sure to stay up to date with all the latest from ISD by following us on Twitter and Facebook at GU Diplomacy, via our company page on LinkedIn, and on Instagram at diverse.diplomacy. You can also find us on our Medium blog, The Diplomatic Pouch, where we post weekly blog posts covering all aspects of diplomacy, written by our staff, fellows, and students. Let's listen to the conversation with Arsalan Suleman.
Arsalan, how are you doing? And thanks for being here.
I'm good, Kelly. Thanks for having me.
You and I met, I don't know now, maybe 7-8 years ago, 9 years ago, something like that, when we were both wandering the halls of the State Department and working on Middle East stuff. And with that in mind, just to kind of start off the episode today, if you could give us a little bit of your background in the State Department. And while you were there, you were the U.S. Acting Special Envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So if you could give us a little bit of background on what that job entails and what you did as part of the role during the Obama administration, that'd be great.
Sure, Kelly. Yeah. So as you mentioned, the last role that I had at the State Department was as the acting U.S. Special Envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC. And the OIC is a 57-member international organization. It's an IO made up of these 57 member states, most of whom have a majority Muslim population, although there are some OIC member states who don't have a majority Muslim population. And the US is not a member or an observer of that international organization. But at the tail end of the George W. Bush administration, the United States decided to create a position called the Special Envoy to the OIC in order to facilitate US diplomatic engagement with the OIC. And so I actually started my work at the State Department in 2010 when I was brought into the department by Rashad Hussain, who was named by President Obama to be his special envoy to the OIC. And so I joined Rashad's staff as his deputy in 2010 and was in that role until until I became the acting envoy for the last 2 years when he moved to a different position. And just kind of as an aside, there was another role that I was playing at the State Department as well, kind of overlapping with my time as the deputy envoy, which is that after the first year after I joined the State Department in 2011, I also began a job with the Human Rights Bureau, DRL, Democracy, Human Rights and Labor Bureau. And there I was working as a counselor for multilateral affairs in their multilateral and global affairs office, working on multilateral human rights policy. And so there was sort of a kind of a double-hatted job that I was doing with the DRL Bureau and with the OIC envoy's office. But anyway, in terms of the OIC work, that work entailed kind of the full range of diplomatic engagement that you would expect the United States to have with an international organization. So we engaged with them on a lot of the key political issues that were priority issues for the administration. The OIC has a pretty active presence in the UN in terms of kind of coordinated member state activity at the UN. So some of our work also entailed engaging with them on UN focused priorities and issues that arose both at the UN in New York and also the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And we also tried, as part of President Obama's effort to have a new beginning in terms of U.S. engagement with Muslim majority countries and communities, we also participated in a lot of the efforts to expand the number of collaborative programs that we had with the OIC specifically, but also Muslim majority countries and communities. So there were a number of programs that we helped to facilitate and establish with other partners in the US government, both State Department offices and USAID. So there were programs related to polio eradication, maternal and child health programs, science and technology exchanges, efforts to combat extremism, efforts to promote educational programs. It was a really broad kind of mandate in terms of helping to establish these kind of cooperative relationships. And so you get that combined with sort of the political engagement and the multilateral engagement. And it really was just a fascinating and exciting portfolio of work that we got to work on and had the honor to work on for President Obama and for the United States government.
So I was a civil servant. You were a political appointee, and a lot of the colleagues we worked with were FSOs. As a non-FSO, how did you find yourself fitting into the world of the State Department, and what would you how do you view the world of sort of reform to kind of make those different, job descriptions or categories kind of line up better?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And there certainly are a number of important kind of reform initiatives that hopefully will help best advise, soon-to-be Secretary Blinken and others on how best to kind of enable the State Department to not only kind of cultivate the right mix of officers, foreign service and civil service, but also bring in talent from the outside. And so, you mentioned I was an appointee. Actually, I was an appointee at the end of the administration. For the last 2 years, I was what they call a Schedule C, a kind of a pure political appointee. But before that, I actually started off as a Franklin Fellow for the first year at the State Department. And the Franklin Fellowship is one of these programs that the State Department has to bring in people who are kind of mid-career type individuals from different spheres and have them come into the department for a short term in order to bring in outside expertise to the department, kind of help to bring in some of the outside talent and to allow the department to benefit from that. Once I came in on the fellowship, I was able to work obviously in the OIC office, but then also work across a number of bureaus, including with the DRL Bureau. And the DRL Bureau is the one that offered me what's called a Schedule B appointment, which is also one of these quasi, it's not a full-on political appointment in the sense that a Schedule C is considered, but it's one of these, it's an appointment. It's like it's a political appointment, I guess you could say, but it's for a smaller period of time. It's for 2 years, and it's renewable. And it's also meant, I think, for people who have a particular expertise or particular ability to sort of add value. And so, for me, someone who was not a foreign service officer and a civil servant, I think these types of pathways into the department, whether they're fellowships or these types of appointments, Schedule Bs and Schedule Cs, I think those are great ways for the department to help bring in, outside talent if they're not able to kind of, in-house provide that kind of talent. Because, of course, for the Foreign Service, you want to ensure that you've got a very diverse and talented Foreign Service, and we certainly do have a very talented Foreign Service, although I think in terms of diversity, there are challenges there, especially as you get to the upper levels. And so these kind of programs where you bring in outside talent is one way to kind of bridge that gap and kind of accelerate the rate at which you're kind of correcting for some of the systematic problems that you have with diversity in particular, because as this incoming Biden administration is emphasizing, not only does the president-elect want to see his administration look like America, but he wants to ensure that the bureaus and agencies and departments are also structuring themselves so that their hiring practices ensure that you have a diplomatic corps, for example, that looks like America. And so, it takes a while. I think if you're only looking at the entry levels, if you're only trying to work on reforming the entry level of the FSOs and civil servants, and I think these other programs that create different pipelines for people to come in can help really add value to these efforts. In addition to just adding value to the department itself, I know a number of very talented people that I got to work with who also came in as Franklin Fellows or came in as different appointees. A number of there's a program I think called the Jefferson Science Fellows that brought in some really talented people who had a scientific background, and that was extremely helpful for some of the health programs and of course climate change activities that were going on. So there's a lot more there that is sort of beyond my own comprehension in terms of the details of the way that the Foreign Service is structured and the civil service. And I know that as far as hiring goes, it can be a challenge sometimes for the offices when they put out positions on USA Jobs, because they might be looking for a particular profile for a candidate, but the way that the system is structured, you end up getting whoever has the most points in the system, and then the HR goes through it. So it sort of creates this incentive for people to kind of game the system to try to make put the right things in, so you get the most points, and then you're considered. And it doesn't necessarily lead to the talent that fits the position best. So certainly there's necessary work to be done to kind of fix those challenges. But from my own perspective, I think some of these alternate pipelines are really important and could be sort of beefed up. The other thing I should mention, other programs like the Presidential Management Fellowship Program and the Wrangle Fellows Program, those are also great programs that have also brought in a lot of really nice, really great talent. And it creates a separate pipeline from what you might have just in the traditional, taking the Foreign Service exam and try to enter that way.
Yeah, and I think as a former civil servant, I've dealt with USA Jobs quite a few times, and it's not the best system in the world, as you mentioned. Let's put it that way. I think if you read something like Uzra Zaya and John Feiner just put together a great document from CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, on State Department reform, and they mention a lot about bringing in systematically including things into our diplomacy more along the lines of global health in order to deal with future pandemics, climate change, science, that kind of stuff, along with also creating more diversification of the employees and, creating more wiggle room between civil service, foreign service, all that kind of stuff, making everything more flexible. And in many ways, that, like you said, that takes time. The paths forward that you mentioned can be useful ones. Moving to the Trump administration a little bit, you wrote a piece a couple months ago bemoaning, correctly in our minds, what you call empty seat diplomacy. Can you describe that a little bit? Tell us what you mean by that and how it's affected U.S. diplomacy and how you think that's going to change, as we just mentioned, reassessments going on as the next administration comes in. But how do you think that's going to change in the next administration?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for whatever reason, the Trump administration decided to leave unfilled a number of diplomatic positions. A number of ambassadorships were unfilled, including to multilateral organizations like ASEAN, like the U.S. The Human Rights Council, from which the United States withdrew under the Trump administration, including the OIC envoy position. I list in the piece, a number of those roles that were left empty. And again, for most of the Trump administration foreign policy, there's never kind of a coherent explanation as to what it is. And I think if you're an observer, like we try to be, you can say that it's the only sort of guide. One of the only guiding principles is, was this good for President Trump, politically and as far as image wise. So ultimately, you had in the Trump administration a transactional foreign policy, a foreign policy that was centered around the president himself and what he felt was good for him. And as part of that, you had a deep antagonism towards multilateral institutions, including the United Nations. And so, a key feature of that was to leave a lot of these positions empty. And, part of that may have been a distrust of people at the State Department, not trusting our foreign service officers and civil service and civil servants, people that they might refer to as the deep state. And people who they might not trust to carry out whatever their vision was on foreign policy, which, of course, it wasn't necessarily that clear. But in any event, the result was that the U.S. was absent in many areas, important areas of diplomatic activity. The United States was absent, and in that piece, I focused in particular on two roles. One was the U.S. ambassador to the Human Rights Council, and the other was the special envoy to the OIC. And I detailed a lot of the ways in which those platforms, those positions, those entities are important arenas for the United States to carry out and to advance its foreign policy. Obviously, at the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council is the premier multilateral body that deals with human rights issues. It's the body that can create mandates that focus attention on areas of concern. It's the body that can create commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions that can end up really, bringing independent reports on situations. And it's the body in which countries can stand up and draw attention to situations and can help to solidify consensus around important human rights norms and reinforce those norms through their advocacy and their work. And I'll just give you an example. One of the cases that I work on right now in my capacity as a lawyer at the law firm Foley Hoag, where I work, is that we represent the Gambia in a lawsuit against Myanmar before the International Court of Justice, arguing that Myanmar violated its obligations under the 1948 Genocide Convention based on its acts of genocide against the Rohingya people of Myanmar. And a critical part of that case and the general consensus that's building around the facts of the acts of genocide that occurred, that were, inflicted on the Rohingya, has been the reports of a UN fact-finding mission that was commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council. And so, if the United States is absent from these bodies, then the United States is not pushing for attention to human rights situations that may be priority issues for us. Right now, for example, you've got over 1 million people who happen to be of the Uyghur ethnicity and Muslim religion in China, who are either in forced internment camps and or are being forced into slave labor to produce various products that China is exporting. And the United States is not at the Human Rights Council raising these concerns. We don't have an ambassador there under the Trump administration. We don't even have someone there authorized from the State Department to fill in and to make statements. And so when the US is absent, and again, the Trump administration didn't just not run for a position, they actually vacated a seat that the US had at the table. And when you vacate the arena, you're basically unilaterally surrendering that platform to other powers. And a perennial battle at these institutions is a battle between states who are trying to uphold human rights standards and trying to defend human rights defenders around the world versus states who are trying to deflect from international scrutiny, who claim sovereignty as a cloak to protect themselves from any criticisms about human rights situations. And China is a leading power in that. So when the United States cuts and runs, it abandons an institution like that in a cowardly fashion like the Trump administration did, then that vacuum gets filled by the Russias and the Chinas and the Cubas of the world. And that's exactly what happened. Russia and China are going to be members of the council next year. The United States is not going to be there. And that's going to have an impact because that's going to make it much harder to get affirmative work done at the Human Rights Council. And we talked about the OIC. When we had an OIC envoy in the Obama administration, we were able to advance a lot of areas of U.S. foreign policy priority issues, working with the OIC on various situations. Whether that was the Arab Spring movements, whether it was the intervention in Libya, whether it was dealing with the Ebola crisis and getting partners on board to help ensure that we're rapidly reacting, or just dealing with human rights issues. We were able to work with the OIC to essentially get rid of a pernicious resolution that had been supported by the OIC called the Defamation of Religions Resolution and replace it with a resolution that was consistent with the U.S. views on free speech, something that no administration had been able to do before. And so when you leave that position empty, you're losing out. You're ceding the ground to other states who are seeking to influence and partner with that entity and those member states. Not only is there the opportunity cost there, but you also just have the long-term damage to that gap in the relationship. And one thing I'll mention, because I was talking about China before, there was a time, I think it was before 2018, where the OIC was actually active in having some statements that raised concerns about the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And China really stepped up their diplomacy with the OIC and was able to essentially get the OIC and its member states to mute their criticism of China. And a big place in which that kind of happened was one of the OIC ministerial meetings that happened, I believe it was in 2018 or 2019 in the UAE. And, there was a resolution that was being debated within the OIC, seeking to draw attention to that situation. And I think, the Chinese were able to ultimately get text in that resolution that praised China for its treatment of Muslims in China, rather than expressing concern about the horrific treatment of the Uyghurs, the crimes against humanity that they're suffering. And so it's an example where, if the US had an envoy to this organization, there would have been someone tracking those kind of developments. There would have been someone saying, hey, the Chinese have a huge delegation to this foreign ministerial, and they're lobbying hard for this kind of text. And you can have then, a response to try to prevent such a negative outcome from happening. But we were absent. And that's the impact of empty seat diplomacy. And I think with this administration, you have a president elect, and you have leaders that he's already selected for his cabinet who very keenly understand the need for an active U.S. presence around the world, and in particular in multilateral bodies where you do have these kind of active debates and these struggles over the direction of these multilateral bodies and institutions, where if the U.S. is absent, then we're going to be ceding that ground. And so I expect the Biden administration to appoint people for all of these roles, and to really emphasize the importance of that diplomacy. And you saw that in the messages that Tony Blinken was sending, that Linda Thomas Greenfield was sending in terms of their remarks after their appointments, saying, very clearly, the United States is back, multilateral diplomacy is back. I loved Ambassador Thomas Greenfield's mention of gumbo diplomacy, because I'm from Louisiana myself. So that's a great line that she had about gumbo diplomacy. But I think all of that is certainly will be true in the Biden administration.
Yeah, and I think your mention of ceding ground is a good one, because you point out the ways that that's happened with entities like the OIC and with the UN HRC, but there's also climate change, ceding the ground to others to lead on this. And not lead as well, potentially, and also on trade. We've seen multiple trade entities come up that the United States isn't a part of. So I think it's, the empty chair diplomacy is a good way to describe it, and I think it goes well into all the different levels of foreign engagement that's going on, whether or not it's the UN and multilateral institutions, trade, climate change, what have you. But I think you're right that this is going to start to change in 2021. So, and that reminds me, I had forgotten that you're from New Orleans. When we're done recording, we're gonna have to talk some Saints. Yes. Saints football, Pelicans basketball. All right, on to things that our listeners actually care about. You mentioned in your answer there the work you're doing currently on the Rohingya and Myanmar. Fascinating and extremely important work. And you told us a little bit about that and what's going on. But how have you found it sort of on the doing these types of roles when you're not part of the U.S. government? How has it been sort of as a private sector actor undertaking these things? And how's the case going, as much as you can tell us?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really interesting because as lawyers, we are representing our clients, and in many ways, it's sort of a similar relationship if you're in government and you're in a position where you're representing the United States, as a diplomat, for example, you're in that role. So it's almost a similar relationship in that sense that, if we've been hired to represent a particular government on an issue in a dispute, then of course we're representing that government to the fullest extent possible, and zealously advocating for their position and seeking the outcome that's most favorable to them. In a similar way where, diplomats are seeking the same thing. They're seeking the best outcome for the United States. If they're a U.S. diplomat, or if they're a foreign diplomat, they're seeking the best outcome for their home country. So just in terms of that kind of mindset, there's some similarities there. But as an attorney, you're not limited to just one client, so you can have more than one client, and I've had the real honor to be able to work for a number of very great clients and for a number of really interesting issues that they're unfortunately dealing with. I mentioned the Gambia, which is suing Myanmar on behalf of the Rohingya victims of genocide in Myanmar. My firm also represents the state of Qatar in their dispute in seeking to undo the aviation blockade and that its neighbors have imposed on it, and so that's also a fascinating case that we had before the International Court of Justice, and now it's back before the ICAO, the International Council on Civil Aviation, the International Civil Aviation Organization. So it's been it's been a real pleasure and an honor to be able to work on some of those cases.
Well, it's important work, as I mentioned, obviously, whether or not it's the Qatar dispute, which I didn't know you guys were working on. That's I'm sure that's fascinating, and the Rohingya issues as well. So, Arsalan, I'd like to say thanks. It's always good to chat. I appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk with us today. It's going to be an interesting next few months as the new administration comes on board, and hopefully you can write another article on filling seats diplomacy in the spring. But I appreciate it, and thanks for coming on.
All right, Kelly, thanks a lot.
That was Diplomatic Immunity. Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website isd.georgetown.edu.